At the peak of his fame, Johnny Depp was more than a movie star. He was a cinematic legend, with roles that ranged from the eerie charm of Edward Scissorhands to the swaggering chaos of Captain Jack Sparrow. Depp had not only carved out a place in Hollywood history, but had also become one of the highest-paid actors in the world. Between 2003 and 2016, it was reported that Depp earned over $650 million. That's not a typo. Nearly $750 million flowed into his accounts. He had major back-end deals with Disney, massive paychecks for films like Pirates of the Caribbean, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, The Lone Ranger, and Fantastic Beasts. He was living the kind of life most people can't even imagine. Sprawling properties in France, a private island in the Bahamas, a collection of luxury cars, yachts, rare art, and an entourage so large it felt more like a traveling court than a team. But beneath the surface, something was off. Behind the charming interviews and red carpet appearances, Depp's financial empire was slowly rotting from the inside. The numbers didn't add up. The spending was erratic, the investments were questionable, and somewhere between the stardom and the solitude, Depp had lost track of what was his and what was bleeding away. He wasn't just spending money, he was setting it on fire. At one point, Depp was reportedly spending over $2 million a month just to sustain his lifestyle. That included $30,000 a month on wine, hundreds of thousands on private jets, and even $3 million to shoot the ashes of author Hunter S. Thompson into the sky using a custom-built cannon. These weren't rumors. They came straight from the lawsuits. In 2017, the world got its first look behind the curtain when Johnny filed a $25 million lawsuit against his longtime business managers at the management group, TMG. He accused them of mismanaging his funds, taking unauthorized loans, failing to pay taxes, and making poor investments that cost him millions. TMG fired back with a countersuit, and the financial truth about Johnny Depp began to spill into the public like gasoline on concrete. According to court documents, Depp's lifestyle had become financially unsustainable. He owned 14 homes, including a French village and a penthouse collection in downtown Los Angeles. He employed 40 full-time staff members, including a sound engineer on payroll just to feed his obsession with background music wherever he went. The court filings painted a picture of a man who had blurred the line between fantasy and finance, who spent money as if the roles he played were real, and the income would never stop. But it did stop. As his legal troubles with TMG escalated, studios began to distance themselves. Rumors swirled of erratic behavior on sets. Some claimed he was hard to work with, unpredictable. Directors still loved him, but producers and insurers became wary. In Hollywood, reputation is currency, and Depp's was rapidly devaluing. Then came 2016, the beginning of the most public and painful chapter in Johnny Depp's life. His divorce from actress Amber Heard ignited a media firestorm. Allegations of abuse, counter-allegations, restraining orders, leaked videos, and tabloid warfare dragged his name through the mud. Endorsements vanished. Roles were dropped. Scripts stopped coming in. The man once seen as untouchable was now seen as radioactive. But even before the public trial that would captivate the world years later, Depp's finances were already in shambles. The lawsuits had drained millions. The properties were being sold. The debts were climbing. He had made hundreds of millions and had almost nothing to show for it. Some blamed his management. Some blamed his spending. Others pointed to the personal chaos, the lawsuits, the relationships, the drugs, the isolation. But whatever the cause, the result was the same. Johnny Depp was broke. Not in the street, not begging for roles, but broke in the way only celebrities can be. Famous, surrounded by luxury, and still dangerously close to financial collapse. And this was all before the legal comeback, before the televised trial, before public sympathy began to shift. Before the internet began to say, wait, maybe we judged him too quickly. This is the story of how Johnny Depp's fortune didn't just disappear. It unraveled, thread by thread, behind velvet curtains and closed doors. And it begins not with betrayal, but with blind trust, the kind that makes you rich until it makes you a cautionary tale. The lawsuit between Johnny Depp and the management group, TMG, wasn't just a legal dispute, it was a public autopsy of celebrity wealth, the kind that rips the mask off glamour and exposes something far more human: carelessness, misplaced trust, and the cost of ignoring reality. In his $25 million suit, Depp accused his managers of fraud, negligence, and mismanagement. He claimed they had loaned out money without his consent, failed to file taxes on time, and took unauthorized fees. His lawyers argued that Johnny had been deceived, that he'd made hundreds of millions, but TMG had mishandled it until only debt remained. But TMG's countersuit flipped the spotlight. In a bold move, they argued that Depp's financial ruin was his own doing, the result of an extravagant lifestyle so excessive that no amount of income could sustain it. Their court filings listed the numbers, and the numbers were staggering. Over $75 million spent on real estate across the globe, more than $18 million on a luxury yacht, around $30,000 per month on imported wines, some bottles costing more than cars. $3 million for that infamous cannon to shoot Hunter S. Thompson's ashes into the sky, $200,000 per month on private jet travel, $150,000 per month for full-time security, and over $1 million per month to maintain his entourage, homes, and lifestyle. It sounded like fiction, but it wasn't. And the deeper you looked, the more it became clear that Johnny Depp wasn't just living large. He was bleeding money at a rate that even Hollywood couldn't refill. His team responded by painting a different picture, that Johnny had trusted professionals to manage his finances, and they failed him, that no one warned him his spending was unsustainable, that he was busy acting, building, performing, and others were supposed to be watching the books. But the damage was done. The world had seen behind the curtain. He had gone from Hollywood's mystery man to a living meme about celebrity waste. Internet headlines turned his finances into punchlines. Tabloids fixated on his every purchase, every sale. When he listed his French estate or his Kentucky horse farm, the headlines weren't "Johnny sells." They were "Johnny forced to sell." He was in a slow-motion financial collapse, and all of it was happening in public. Meanwhile, the Amber Heard divorce only added gasoline to the fire. Legal fees skyrocketed. Settlements loomed. Depp paid $7 million to Heard in the settlement, claiming it was a clean break. But the damage to his public image, and by extension, his career and earning power, was already severe. Studios began to worry. Contracts became harder to negotiate. Insurance companies questioned whether they could cover a film with Johnny attached. He was still a box office draw, but now he came with fine print and legal baggage. The film industry is brutal in its pragmatism. You are either an asset or a liability. And by 2018, Johnny was veering dangerously toward the second category. He had to sell assets, properties, art, memorabilia, even his yacht, once a floating symbol of his excess, had to go. And as the money flowed out, a new feeling settled in: isolation. People around him shifted. Some left, some sued, some sold their stories. The inner circle got smaller, and the world, once charmed by his eccentricities, now watched with curiosity or pity. To make things worse, he had begun losing control over one of the few things that had always kept him afloat: his reputation. He was no longer seen as the quiet rebel, the mysterious genius, the man of poetic darkness. He was now seen as a fallen prince, messy, angry, bitter, and broken. And the more he tried to defend himself, the more the media spun it as desperation. So he withdrew. He avoided interviews. He leaned into his art, his music, his private passions. But the debt kept climbing. The lawsuits didn't stop. The world wouldn't let him forget. He was still working. Roles in Fantastic Beasts, indie films, voice acting. But the fees were smaller. The deals were more fragile. And the shadow of collapse followed him everywhere. This was not the Johnny Depp of red carpets and smirks. This was a man being swallowed by the consequences of his own silence, or perhaps his trust in others to speak for him. By 2019, one thing had become tragically clear. Johnny Depp was no longer Hollywood's golden child. He was a man with a fortune in ashes, still trying to act like he wasn't burning. But the fire wasn't done yet. Because what came next? A lawsuit filed by Depp against Amber Heard for defamation would drag him from the financial ruins into the courtroom spotlight, and this time, the entire world would be watching. By 2019, Johnny Depp had reached a crossroads, the kind that doesn't just define a career but a legacy. He was broke, at least by Hollywood standards. His name was tainted. Studios were hesitant. And every time his face appeared in the press, it was connected to lawsuits, debt, or scandal. He could have disappeared, retreated, lived off the royalties, sold more properties, and faded into the shadows. But he didn't. Instead, he made the most dangerous decision of his life. He fought back. In March 2019, Johnny Depp filed a $50 million defamation lawsuit against his ex-wife, Amber Heard, in response to an op-ed she had written for the Washington Post in December 2018. In the article, Heard identified herself as a survivor of domestic abuse. She never named Depp directly, but the implication was clear. Depp's team argued that the op-ed had caused irreparable damage to his reputation, career, and income. He claimed it was the final blow in a years-long campaign that had cost him everything. Not just his money, but his identity. It wasn't just about image anymore. It was about truth. But this move wasn't just risky emotionally. It was a financial gamble of staggering proportions. Court cases are expensive. High-profile ones? Brutal. The legal fees alone would cost Depp millions. The PR fallout, the resurfacing of painful personal details, the risk of further reputational collapse. It was a bet that could leave him financially ruined and publicly destroyed. But he went ahead anyway. Why? Because for Depp, this wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a final stand. His lawyers began to argue that he had been the victim of false allegations, that he had lost acting roles, endorsements, and millions in potential revenue because of a narrative that was never fairly investigated. They pointed to recordings, inconsistencies, and new testimonies. They claimed that Johnny had stayed quiet for too long, letting his silence be interpreted as guilt. But going to court meant exposing everything. His private texts, his drug use, his fights, his emotional instability, the chaos of his marriage. All of it would be laid bare and weaponized against him. And that's exactly what happened. The media had a field day. Each day of testimony brought new headlines, new memes, new judgments. Depp's personal life became a global spectacle, dissected on YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, and primetime TV. Fans picked sides, journalists wrote think pieces, lawyers went viral. Every word spoken in that courtroom echoed across the internet, and Johnny had no control over any of it. But something strange began to happen. As more evidence surfaced, the narrative started to shift. People who had once distanced themselves from him began to reconsider. The image of a one-sided monster began to unravel. The public began to ask deeper questions, not just about Johnny, but about how society handles accusations, guilt, and the court of public opinion. And behind the drama, one fact remained. Johnny had lost more than almost any celebrity in modern history without being convicted of a single crime. He had lost franchises, millions, homes, friends, peace of mind, and now he was risking what little he had left in order to clear his name. Some called it foolish pride. Others saw it as raw courage. But whatever it was working. By the time the courtroom battle hit its peak in 2022, the internet had become a battlefield of opinions. But more importantly for Johnny, Hollywood was watching. Studios, brands, and collaborators began quietly running polls, asking audiences, would you watch Johnny Depp again? Would you forgive him? And the answers started to shift. But financially, the fight was still bleeding him dry. Lawsuits aren't just expensive, they delay income, freeze potential deals, and drain attention. Depp had poured nearly everything he had into the case, and there was no guarantee of victory. He wasn't just fighting for money. He was fighting to survive in the industry that had once crowned him king, and then cast him out like a pariah. And if he lost this case, the consequences would be permanent. No more comebacks, no more redemption, no more second chances. Just the long, slow fade of a disgraced legend with empty accounts and a louder silence. But even as the legal storm raged, Johnny appeared in court every day, calm, dressed in dark suits, sketching in a notebook, occasionally smiling. To some he looked tired, to others relieved, because in many ways this was the first time he was telling his story on his own terms, under oath, in full. The man who had spent a lifetime hiding behind characters was finally standing alone, not as Jack Sparrow or the Mad Hatter or Sweeney Todd, but as Johnny. And for the first time in years the world wasn't laughing. It was listening. As the trial unfolded, something unprecedented was happening. The world was tuning in, not to cancel Johnny Depp, but to witness his resurrection. Millions of people across the globe followed the court proceedings like a daily drama. Live streams of the courtroom were watched by tens of millions. Clips of Johnny on the stand went viral, not for outbursts or scandalous moments, but for quiet honesty, humor, and vulnerability. He wasn't acting. He wasn't spinning. He was just human. In a world used to slick PR, his flaws became his strength. He admitted to drug use, to rage, to emotional breakdowns. He didn't pretend to be perfect, but he also didn't dodge questions or deflect blame. His testimony painted a picture not of a monster, but of a broken man, wounded, betrayed, and desperately trying to find his footing in a life that had spun out of control. And people responded. Supporters began showing up outside the courthouse daily. Social media turned into a battleground of opinions, but the momentum clearly began to shift in Johnny's favor. Memes of him smiling, fan art, hashtags like Justice for Johnny Depp and I Stand with Johnny trended globally. But for every cheer, there was still an underlying truth. Financially, Johnny was still in a tailspin. The trial had halted all projects. Insurance and brand partnerships remained frozen. Every day in court meant more legal fees. Top-tier attorneys, researchers, strategists, publicists. His financial team wasn't just trying to balance a budget. They were trying to stop a landslide. He sold more properties, let go of more staff, and by some reports, dipped into retirement accounts and backup funds just to keep everything afloat. For a man who once earned $50 million per film, Johnny was now fighting to keep the lights on, both figuratively and literally. Still, he never broke publicly. He appeared calm, composed. His focus wasn't the money. It was the verdict, because that verdict, more than any paycheck, could change everything. Then came June 1st, 2022. After weeks of testimony, deliberations, and media frenzy, the jury delivered its decision. Johnny Depp had won. Amber Heard was found liable for defamation, and Depp was awarded $10 million in compensatory damages and $5 million in punitive damages, later reduced to $350,000 due to Virginia law. The courtroom was silent as the words were read, but the internet erupted. For many, it was more than a victory. It was vindication. A man accused, condemned, and discarded by the industry had stood his ground and been believed. But behind the applause, the financial reality was still complex. The judgment wasn't immediate cash. It had to be appealed, processed, negotiated. And Amber Heard, for her part, didn't have the money to pay the full amount. Legal analysts predicted years of back and forth before Johnny would see a dime, if ever. Still, the win had something even more valuable than money: reputation. Within weeks, his phone started ringing again. Quietly at first. European film festivals, indie directors, luxury brands testing the waters. Then louder. Offers from producers who had once distanced themselves. Messages from friends who had fallen silent. And most importantly, audiences wanted him back. In July 2022, he made a surprise appearance at concerts with Jeff Beck. Soon after, he was cast as King Louis XV in Jean du Barry, a French-language film, his first major role since the trial. The public welcomed him. Critics took notice, and streaming platforms began re-promoting his past work. The industry hadn't forgotten his financial collapse, but now it was willing to forgive it, or at least look past it, because in Hollywood, nothing sells like a comeback. Still, behind the resurgence, Johnny knew the truth. He wasn't returning to the life he had before. That world, with its private islands, reckless spending, and untouchable fame, was gone. He wasn't trying to rebuild the empire. He was trying to rebuild himself. He gave fewer interviews, took on smaller, passion-driven projects, returned to music, focused on art. He didn't need to dominate the box office anymore. He just needed to find peace. And in that peace, perhaps for the first time, he began to understand what fortune had never taught him, that your name, your voice, and your dignity are worth more than any paycheck. He hadn't just won a lawsuit. He had survived the fire, and somehow emerged with something money can't buy. In the months following the verdict, Johnny Depp's life didn't return to normal, because the life he had before no longer existed. He wasn't stepping back into the same Hollywood, the same public perception, or the same financial reality. The court had cleared his name, but not his debts. His fortune was still a shadow of what it once was. From a peak estimated at over $650 million, experts speculated that by 2022, Depp's liquid assets had dwindled to less than $10 million. Much of his real estate had been sold. Lawsuits, some resolved, others still active, continued to chip away at his remaining wealth. His once sprawling staff was reduced. The lavish spending? Gone. But maybe that was the point. Because now every dollar mattered. Every project had purpose. Every decision was measured, thoughtful, not driven by ego or indulgence, but by experience and caution. He began painting, touring with his band, accepting roles that weren't blockbuster paychecks, but passion pieces. One of his most notable returns was not in a Disney film or a Warner Brothers epic, but in a French historical drama. Fewer stunts, more depth, less noise, more soul. And for the first time in decades, he wasn't living for the camera. He was living for himself. He didn't do a victory lap. There were no tell-all books or I told you so interviews. He let the work and the silence speak for him. Behind closed doors, he reconnected with old friends, focused on family, stayed close to those who had stood by him when everyone else vanished. He played music for crowds, not to be seen, but to feel something again, something real. Because when you lose everything, money, fame, reputation, what you're left with is a question few are ever forced to answer. Who am I without all of it? For Johnny Depp, the answer came slowly. Through courtrooms, headlines, betrayals, and a haunting quiet that followed the chaos. He was no longer Jack Sparrow, or Willy Wonka, or the face of a franchise. He was a man who had made mistakes, trusted the wrong people, lost control, been wrongly accused, gone broke, and survived. Not because he was perfect, but because he was persistent. The industry that once discarded him now cautiously opened its doors again. Not with full arms, but with curiosity. Could Johnny make a second act? Would audiences still care? And they did. But maybe not because he was the same. Maybe because he was finally something different. Not a product, but a person. In a world that builds people up to break them down, Johnny Depp's story wasn't just about fame or fortune. It was about what happens when those things collapse, and you're still standing. His financial empire may never be what it was. The castles and islands may never return. But what he gained was far rarer than wealth. A second chance. A voice, unfiltered. A future built on truth, not illusion. So now, when people speak of Johnny Depp, they don't just mention the lawsuits or the money or the downfall. They talk about something else. Resilience. Because money can vanish, roles can fade. But character, when tested, reveals what fortune never could. And in the end, maybe that's the real story. Not how he lost everything, but how he found what matters after it was gone.